winning. But as part of this conversation, we started talking about beyond individual excellence. And so Catherine brought the lens of the work that they've done and in helping universities to revise their curriculums to be more marketplace ready, to be more relevant for what is going on in the marketplace today. And so they worked with the universities around that, talked about how they worked with the faculty, how they worked with the students, how they worked with the administration. And because of that, thousands of young people now have access to upgraded curriculums in the context of tech. They're also building a community of women in tech. And she talked about that, which was a fantastic conversation. And then we also had Dr. Anne, who is very passionate about building systems in public health care. And she gave a journey around from how she started as a medical doctor in Makueni and just landed in hospitals and found those hospitals were just dysfunctional. She was the first person to show up. It's 8 a.m. and no one has showed up. 9 a.m. no one has showed up. The equipment is broken down. The ambulance is broken down. And shared the journey around how she went about transforming that hospital, but also realizing that there's a systemic gap that then ended up her now becoming the CEO of the Kenya Healthcare Federation. Both of those two ladies were recognized in our 2025 Top Purpose Driven Leaders Awards. As Lapid, we have a process where we identify purpose driven leaders in the market and we go through an extensive process around that and then honor and recognize them. And both women were of the top 12 purpose driven leaders we recognized in 2025. And again, that was a fantastic conversation. If you missed it, please go to YouTube. And that was the second one. And then the third one was what we had last week. And we hosted Jeff Sean. Jeff Sean is a good friend of Lapid, but also was nominated as a top purpose-driven leader in 2024, doing some phenomenal work in the space of media. He's a co-founder for Akili TV, serves millions of children in this country. And he gave us a fantastic lens around what enabled them to build Akili TV. They've been in existence, I think, for the last 6.5 years, having been launched in 2020. And he talked about what enabled him to be able to go live in 2020 and the 8-year process of preparing for that. He talked about Singapore, comparing the creative economy in Kenya and South Korea. I compared it with Singapore in my brain, but with South Korea and Canada. And because of that, I spent the last week just sort of digging up the creative economy in the South Korea space. And there's so much that we can learn from South Korea. I mean, one of the bigger things, and I did a LinkedIn live on Monday and sort of just gave a bit of that, but there's an article online around it. And actually, Fidel, please share it here. But one of the things that I loved about sort of digging up the creative economy in South Korea, it's a $14.9 billion industry. I'm going to have to repeat that. $14.9 billion industry. And they were comparing it in some of the research papers, they were comparing it with sort of your large electronic and Samsungs and such equivalent companies. But the manufacturing industry has about $4.7 billion and creative economy is 14.9. And there's a lot of conversations around what has enabled them to grow that economy. A lot of it, and I can't go into all the details, please go through the article. The one that I want to lift is they did the work of converting culture into an economic vehicle. It's very easy to talk about the African culture. They talk about the K culture, and what they did is build gaming and build movies and conversations around the K culture, but then embedded it in such a way that it became an economic driver. So, for example, they have funds that enable people to have access to institutional building, a creative economy funds, so that then it's not a hustling. I think that we've done a fantastic job of making creative economy a hustling thing. It has significant gaps when you start to think about it and compare it with other countries. And so I've highlighted some of those things within the article. But I think what they did is sort of one of the big things that I liked is one, they set up a fund. And the fund was about institution building. And the idea was you cannot go to a bank and get a loan for building a game, an online game, because banking, the way it's structured, was way before your creative economy. They will ask you for security. They don't understand what the asset is. And so they created a fund that made it possible for people to have easy access to sort of funds to build that online game. And then the other thing that they did is they built the infrastructure around those games as an example. And so what that means is people watch the game, encounter the K culture, are intrigued by South Korea because of what they've built within it. And so tourism became a beneficiary of this creative economy. And then there's almost the manufacturing that also comes with that because they then figure out the full system behind that culture and create it. And I think the thing that stood out for me with regards to the creative economy is it's easy to talk about creative economy as a driver of the economy. It's easy to talk about it as a possibility, but it will never become a reality unless you have the infrastructure. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about sort of the benefit of AI and how AI is making it possible for people to leverage on creativity to build faster, but that doesn't take away the underneath infrastructure that's needed. Every product will always need capital, it will always need markets, it will always need skills. And so asking what's the system for capital, what's the system for markets, and what's the system for skills is something that perhaps we need to spend quite a bit of time on. And it was a good conversation. We are planning to hold a mini dialogue. If you've already signed up within our main database, we are now moving towards hosting mini dialogues that go deeper into some of those conversations. And the next mini dialogue will focus on, we have one, I think, scheduled for education and employability, but we are also putting together one on creative economy that just explores some of what I have shared. And so that was last week. I am about to go into what was this week, but I want to hear from us. Have you been part of the last four? If you have, please share within the chat room, and we would love to celebrate you. Or have you attended three, or have you attended two, or how many are those? I think this is the fourth one. I believe this is the fourth one. Yes, fourth one. Or is this your first
Yes.
one? I'd love to be able to hear from us. Have you attended, how many sessions have you attended in the past? What's something that has stayed with you from the past? And just some takeaways would also be very helpful for us. We want to be able to hear from you. We will also share a link to, we have what we call a WhatsApp community that focuses on next chapter signals. We call them next chapter signals. It's a first place we share our events. It's the first place that we share our articles, and Fidel will share a link to that in the course of this conversation. But yeah, I want to hear from us. Is this your first one? Is it your second one? Why did you choose to attend this one? What stayed with you in the one that you attended? Please put up in the chat room. Let's just sort of hear from each one of us. What have you attended before and what has stayed with us? And I say that because it's very easy to attend conversations and then they disappear immediately. But I want to hear from us what has stayed with you, because it also helps us to see what we build up on as we think about the ecosystem that's behind the dialogues. So please share in the group, in the chat room. Which one did you attend? What stayed with you? And what are you looking forward to? Before I just sort of share some thoughts in a short while. Jerry Nyoro from Kenya. I'm in my chat room now because I'm hoping to see a bit more chat room going in terms of what stayed with us. Chris from Bahrain, Karibu Chris. Karibu means welcome. You will need to catch some Swahili, so we will keep throwing some Swahili here. But welcome to this space. Denise, good evening. Thank you for joining us. And you're joining us from Rwanda. Karibu. I don't know if you guys have some Swahili, but we will teach you some Swahili. Karibu from Rwanda, and we'd love to see you be part of the community. Liz from Eldoret, welcome. I think I've seen Liz before, but welcome and thank you for joining us again. Jerry Nyoro from Kenya, thank you, Jerry, for joining us. I'm Derek Mugodo from AgriPlant, Kenya Youth-Led Agri-Tech Enterprise, that's working to advance climate-smart agriculture through hydroponics, irrigation. Glad to be part of this meeting. That's some fantastic work, Derek. We tend to be very fascinated by the whole conversation of hydroponics. So thank you for sharing that. I hope you can keep sharing what you do. What are incentives and how do we incentivize people is something that Victor is thinking about. Chris, this is the second one. Denise is the second one. Have you attended any session? Margaret, this is the second one, and I missed the last one, and I was not happy. I'm happy you were not happy, but fortunately the recording is online. You please feel free to pick it up. Sheila, karibu sana. Happy to be here. I really want to hear what stayed with us from the ones that we shared. I mean, the ones that we attended before. So I'm gonna give us a minute. I'm a teacher and I don't struggle with quietness. I think it's important for people to have moments of reflection. And I do know I have less than 10 minutes to go before the speaker joins, but I would love to make sure that we have a quick recap of what stayed with us. So, what is a thought that was shared in the last dialogue that you attended? Because it sounds to me like many of us, this is our second or our third one. What is a thought that was shared that you're still sitting with or that's still alive for you? I'd love to hear that before we move to today's session. I'm going to also put Fidel in the spotlight in a short while to share something that stayed with her, just because I need us to sort of just have a quick recap before we move forward. So yeah, what stayed with you? Fidel, do you want to go first as we wait for others to put up in the chat room?
Sure, yes. I think I resonated very well with the second dialogue, where Catherine, was sharing about, when they had to, when she was made MD, and then she had to go and, go to the universities and work with the lecturers, work with the teachers, to bring change into the curriculum, the IT curriculum in the university. That really stayed with me. Then there's something she said also, and she said that actually no one, it's us to do the work. No one is actually coming to do the work for us. We have to roll up our sleeves and do the work ourselves. No one is coming to save us, which is also something that Esther, keep telling us. We do Crossroads communities. And one thing when I joined Crossroads, they were like, no one is coming to save you and no one is coming to do the work for you. You have to do the work. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I love that. I think it was the idea of there's gaps in our education curriculums, but people are constantly talking about those gaps, but not doing the work for it. And what Catherine said is first, they went in without clarity of how it will go. And she said something that stayed with me. It was just try it. Just try. Get your hands dirty, get in and do something and learn from it. And so just try it was something she left us with. But also she said it's in the tuko, which means that we are the ones who are in the soko. There's no one else who's coming to do the work other than us. And so doing the deep work of figuring out what are the gaps, what are the challenges, and going back and constantly iterating was something that Catherine highlighted in her session. I'm just keen to hear voices with experience of development in Africa. That's a good place to start, Chris. And thank you for sharing that. There's such immense experiences within the community, and we are happy to share those with you and others. One of the reasons why we do these dialogues is we found we have these conversations in the context of LAPID. I mean, it's a constant conversations that we have, whether it's on capital or in climate. We constantly have these conversations, but we want to be able to share this with other leaders such as yourself, Chris. So thank you for sharing that. Caroline, look for peripheral income sources away from the main source. I love that. I think last time we spent quite a bit of time talking about sources of capital. And one of the things that stayed with me, and this was shared by Carol, was thinking about the work that you do and asking how do you separate the kinds of capital that you need for the works that you do. And so she talked about some of the work that you do should be funded by revenue, especially if it's directly attributable to the work. It's a revenue, and you want to make sure you have revenue as a main way of thinking of your business. And I repeat that because as a country, we have been accustomed to grants, we've been accustomed to funding. I make fun of the fact that USAID was here for hundreds of years. I mean, it wasn't hundreds of years, but for centuries. And when they left, we still hadn't figured out what's the answer for HIV/AIDS. We have to ask beyond grants, beyond development funds, what are the things that we can build that enable us to have revenue from the various spaces that we are building? And so that was one. The second thing she talked about is separating the infrastructure work and the ecosystem work, and then being able to fundraise for ecosystem, because ecosystem needs patient capital, and therefore then having various types of revenue that you're going for within your organization. Akili also talked about this, that they have several sources of income. They started out as a children's TV alone. Now they're a family network. and they do events and they have the TV channel, and they are now expanding towards the mobile and asking how do we make that into a revenue space, and how do we also leverage the change conversation, because they drive change to the kids and mothers, and that becomes a source of revenue, that's grants. And so thinking holistically in the context of what products do you have and what are multiple sources that you can be able to expand income from was important. The importance of developing solutions based on the root cause. Catherine's experience of identifying that our graduates from the tech space were not competitive and there was need to solve it. Absolutely. And I think part of it, and this is something that we all have to train our minds for. Today we're having a conversation with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about how if he had excess money, the place that he would invest in today is water. 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 Um, for him, it's just ridiculous that access to water is as difficult as it is in many parts of this country. But even in developed parts of this country, we have learned to take water from the tap, boil it, and then drink it, because you cannot trust the water that you get from your tap. And those are ridiculous problems in many ways. But I think it's understanding that those problems represent possibilities that are solutions. And I think that's what Catherine did. Catherine found that every time they did a recruitment call, they struggled to pick up local graduates. And so what she did is say, let's go back to the universities and figure out what's the gap, so that then those graduates are not being able to join Microsoft and other organizations. And so just sort of going to the root of the problem is a big part of building solutions. I wish we can get a summary of for the yesterday topic. It looks interesting as per topic. Thank you, Denise. We will, for now, the thing we are committing to is putting up the recordings online. There's some reports that we are releasing somewhere along the way, but for now, you can spend some time on what is online. On the second dialogue, I learned that trust determines capital. Absolutely. The importance of long-term thinking over urgent wins, the power of starting small, creating centers of excellence, and also the importance of taming temptations for approval. And I will just lift the trust one. I think we underestimate how business building is a work of building trust. And the job is ultimately to be able to ask, what is the trust gap in this space and how do I feel it? And I talk about this often and share that part of the reason we pay 20% interest, as an example, I think right now it's 17 to 20% within your banking space for loans, is a trust gap, because the bank is trying to make sure they will recover their money. Now, in developed economies, what they have done is they've put addresses. So when Esther takes a loan, the bank gets my address, my home address, and so it's easy for them to track me. Here, it is very easy for people to get away with not being tracked. And so that lack of trust is what is then added into the interest rate, and that's how you end up paying 19-20% of interest. And so trust is a big part of everything you will build. I think Carol talked about the gap between the trust of funders and the trust of builders. And when you find that you're struggling with fundraising, the gap ultimately is trust, and asking the question, what are the systems that are here that reduce trust? So for example, you will find that accelerators and fellowships, I've been part of several fellowships. What they do is they minimize the trust gap. And so then the person who is giving capital starts to think, okay, somebody has done the due diligence of this person, and so the trust gap is reduced. And trust is a big part of that conversation. Jeff encouraged me, opportunity meets readiness. Absolutely. Took 8 years, but he was ready when the opportunity came. Absolutely. We have 2 years, one time. So listening comes first, and sharing experience and knowledge gives us all. Love it. So let's keep sharing some of the thoughts that have stayed with us from the previous conversations. I'm just going to set pace and in a few minutes, and then we will start the session. But again, thank you for joining us. We truly appreciate it. We call this the Unveiled Future Dialogues. I like to explain why. There's a lot of conversations in the context of Africa around this being Africa's century, and it's built around numbers. It's built around resources. I think the bigger thing is numbers. It's said that by 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African, and 1 in 4 people will be African. And because of that, it's then termed as Africa's century. If you combine that with the fact that that's the workforce, I think that's a dangerous thing when you think about it in terms of AI. But let's just keep going. I'm an analytical, so I see the plus and minuses with such ease. But yes, the plus, the numbers of young people, the mineral resources that we have, there's a lot of things that have been said that then is argued that makes this Africa century. But I also argue that we have been in this space for too long, and I shared this in the last dialogue. I have a good friend of mine who told me about how 30 years ago he was having the conversation around Africa rising. And if you go, there's a time when I was starting my professional life, I think in the early 2000s, there's a lot of reports that McKinsey did on the lions on the move. And there was this whole conversation of Africa rising, Africa, the next big thing. And the point I make is we do not become Africa's century or the Africa's big thing if just because of hope. And I argued last time that I was in a conversation with President Obama. I was part of the Obama Fellowship. We were 20, and so we had a privilege of sitting with them in boardrooms, which was just such a privilege. And one of the things that you hear him talking about a lot is hope. I think his whole philosophy is built around hope. And actually, these are cards. They're written hope to action values. And so he's very big on hope. If you look at all his campaigns, the biggest thing that he talks about is hope. Yes, we can, all those conversations. But I think one of the things that he also says is hope is important because society without hope and hopelessness is very dangerous. But you also must ask, how do you convert hope into action? And so we have hope of the African numbers, the Africa century. But why we have these conversations that are called unbuilt future dialogues is how do we move from hope to action? What needs to happen in the various sectors? What has not been built yet? And so the title of Unbuilt Futures Dialogues. And you can think about that in the context of creative economy. And I've talked about that, and an article has been shared with you guys in the group. The significant unbuilt future in the creative economy is a very good example. And so, sort of elevating the understanding of the unbuilt futures in those sectors is part of the commitment that we make, but also then asking how do we convert those from just an awareness to things that we actually build. And so you will have had Fidel talking about the Women of Purpose Summit, and that's a space that we will go and ask, what do we build as women? We do not think it's only women who need to build. It's just that's a space for what do we build. So all these unbuilt futures dialogues have raised the following things. What are the commitments that we can make to go and build? We have other programs that we run that are Crossroads, for example, has both men and women that sits with the question again, what must I build? Because those unbuilt futures are things that we need to spend time on. And so that's sort of the context of this conversation. What must I build is the question that we are interested in. Increasingly, we've become interested not simply in leadership, but in builders, because leaders can become about occupying a position well, but builders ask, what becomes possible because I was a leader in this space? What becomes possible because of the knowledge that I have carried in this place? Builders are trying to change something. And so today, with that context in mind, we want to talk about the human side of transformation. And this is one of my favorite conversations. I have to manage my brain because I could easily geek it out, because we can change the strategy, we can change the policy, we can introduce the technology, we can redesign the institutions, we can even train the people, we can even communicate the vision and still find that people do not behave differently. If you're a teacher, if you're a change maker, if you're a leader, you will have done all of those things and then found actually at the end of the tunnel, humans don't want to do that work that you have done the whole job of pitching. And so there can be an enormous gap between what people know, what people intend to do, what people actually do. And if we don't understand the gap, we may build technically brilliant solutions that people never adopt. And so at the core of the questions that we are sitting with today in our Unbuild Future is around why do people, organizations, and societies? I am very driven by societies. I'm very passionate about leadership, but I think about leadership as a tool for social transformation. And so, why do people, organizations, societies so often fail to make the changes they already know they need to make? Is a question that I'm sitting with today. And I'm going to be joined by the phenomenal Francis Mayo to explore that question, what needs to change, what actually makes change possible, and how we can, what are some of the things that we can pick up from the work that they've done to be able to lift up behavioral change as a possibility that enables us to drive change. So, karibu sana, Francis. I'm going to give Fidel a minute to read your bio because I think it's important for people to meet with you with your bio first. And then I'm going to tell them what I think about the work that you do, and then we can pick it up from there. But karibu sana. Fidel, perhaps you can read for us the bio in a minute or so. Okay. Fidel has the... Fidel, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Technology issues, but it is okay. Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. Kindly just introduce Francis for us.
Okay. Thank you so much, Esther. It is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker this evening, Francis Mayo, the CEO of Busara. Francis works at the intersection of behavioral science, research, and practice, asking a relatively simple set of questions. What works in development? Why does it work? And how do we ensure that what works becomes part of the institutions and systems that shape people's lives? As CEO of Busara, he leads the organization's work to advance and apply behavioral science across the global majority, with a particular interest in helping institutions turn evidence into capabilities, routines, policies, and practices that endure. Francis, welcome to the Unbuilt Future Dialogues. We are delighted to have you with us. Thank
And
you.
thank you, Francis. I mean, Fidel, for sharing that. I honor Francis for being in this space. Francis, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the top purpose-driven leaders in 2024. We went to visit him with some of my team members, I think, last year, and we all got so overwhelmed by the work that they're doing that we thought it's just better to bring it here. Francis, thank you so much for making the time to be part of this conversation. We celebrate you and the work that you're doing, and it matters a lot to this continent. I think there is a lot of disservice that's done to this continent when we don't anchor behavioral ideas within it. So thank you so much for the work that you do. I am going to start by saying I will not cover everything I'd love to cover. I think we just need to one day build a whole course with you guys because I think the work that you're doing is just phenomenal. If I could do anything to spread it, I spent like hours in your case studies. I just kept thinking this is geeking. But thank you, Karibu Sana. And maybe let's start with sort of just some ideas and thoughts that you'd love to share with us around the work that you do and why you enjoy it. Could be a good place to start.
Thank you very much, Esther. Truly appreciate it. And then thank you to Fidel for that wonderful introduction of me. As you were reading it, I said, who's that person? That's not me. And thank you, Lapid Leaders, as well. And thanks for everyone who is here and who you brought us together. I thought I would start by something very ordinary, something that I think we all get to do, and something that can bring some of what we work on to the fore. And that is something that I hope we all do several times a day, right? And that is washing hands, right? And we've all been taught how to wash our hands since childhood. We all know that it matters. We all know how to do it well. But a question I have is, do we always do it properly? Do we always do it consistently? And perhaps the honest answer is mixed, right? And I would take you back perhaps half a decade when COVID-19 happened, right? It made it very visible. The entire world, right, was being reminded how to do something that we have supposedly known for years, if not decades. When to wash our hands, how to wash our hands, right? Why to wash our hands, how long to wash our hands. And that to me is this forms a perfect example of behavior, institutions, and systems, and why at times we always don't do what we are meant to do, right? When you enter a restaurant, you may see signs, employees must wash their hands. Always wonder, what about diners? Is it okay not to, right? But even when you go to hospitals, when you go to clinics, you see reminders of hand washing placed right in front of the tap, right? These are very highly trained professionals in our society. And they understand infection prevention, for example, right? But that critical moment of action, they still need a reminder to just nudge them a little bit, right? It's a microsecond, but it's wash your hands for 20 seconds. They even have images, right, on how to do it. So that to me is sort of this, what I would offer as a proposition this evening, which is knowing what to do does not equate to doing it, right? Intending to do something does not equate to doing it. Doing something once, right, does not equate to do it. And I think we see this everywhere. If everyone can remember the New Year's resolutions, right? We intend to save more. We intend to exercise, right? But we intend to arrive on time. We intend to start on time. We intend to give honest feedback. But for one reason or another, some of our best intentions don't always translate to our actions. And we know that there may be competing priorities, there may be different incentives, there may be friction, there may be the environment in which we're operating it changes. And so I thought that would be from some compelling opening remarks to spur on the conversation. Thank you.
Just left me with more questions about myself. But I really like that as an example, because washing hands is the one thing we all grow up doing. I mean, from when you're a child, there's a song that sang, wash your hands. And yet, even the most intelligent people who are doing the surgery work have to be reminded, wash your hands. This is how you do it. So I love that example, and I'm going to come back to it. But what came to mind is, I'm a very values-driven kind of leader, and there's some work that we do around personalities, and we talk about there are leaders who drive with values. They think about doing the right thing as an example. And the problem with many values-driven leaders, using myself as a bad example, as an example, is we design with the imagination that people will do the right thing because it's the right thing. And I always give the example of, I watched a movie a while back and watched some people put in some machine, some clock or whatever, for some guys who, when they run to the sea, they will drown. And so they decided to design some clocks that when you drown, we will come and find you. And I remember thinking, what is wrong with that human being? Why are they going to the middle of the sea so that they need to come and be rescued? Is the way I would think about it. But I think the person who's designing that thing is aware of the fact that if we need to be reminded to wash our hands, you best design for the fact that somebody will go to the middle of the sea. And I think the place I start with that is why. I mean, and you probably have mentioned some of those things. You talk about competing priorities and the friction and the incentives. Is that why the let's just use that example for the surgery and the surgeon who's done this many times? Why do they need that reminder, honestly?
Yeah, no, great question. Now, it's because imagine you prepare, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not a surgeon, but I can imagine these are very complex procedures that one needs to prepare for. One needs to get their hands in, and it's the most important thing that they're going to do, right? But you still have these very small instances of whether you do an action like washing your hands, right, or not, and it has some very big consequences as well, right? You can infect a patient. Oh my God, what would have happened there, right? And so I think the way to really think about it is not only are my values or individual belief systems part of what will lead me to the desired actions, but within the system and that I'm operating in. So if a surgeon was to try and enter an OR without scrubbing, right, themselves, I would imagine that that would be a no-no, and there will be someone to stop them, right? Even if it's someone junior than them. I'm imagining the surgeon being the most senior person. So I think the ways of working, the policies that exist, the checklists that exist, but also the social norms, right, that exist. We've had quack doctors, even here in Kenya, who start operating and folks get infected. And I think that is the idea that within that community of kind of medical practitioners, they understand beyond any guidelines that there's a way that they should perform the duties and the mandates that they have in society.
That's interesting, because I think what I'm hearing you say is, so there's a gap between knowledge, intention, and behavior. And the business of design, the business of leadership, the business of change making is not assuming that knowledge and intention will become behavior change.
Correct.
And ultimately designing the things that move between knowledge, intention to behavior intentionally. And so in this case, I'm hearing you say first, maybe even, is there a benefit in knowing that, because I like the example you gave for the surgeon, and what I'm hearing is there's a competing priority there, which could be, how do I figure out how to go and do that surgery so fast? Maybe I need to go home and sort of look at my kids. Maybe it's the mental tiredness of this surgery, this process. So there's a competing priority in effect in between the knowledge, intention, and behavior. And what I'm hearing you say, and you could correct me on that, is as I design always, I must understand that between knowledge and behavior will be competing priorities, and it is my job then to put together possibilities that reduce that.
Correct. And it's you mentioned the keyword design, right? And in my field, we try and call it as behavioral design as well, right? And behavioral design seeks to fill what we call an intention action gap, right? And with the surgeon, or with the reminder, right, at the top, what we're essentially trying to do is to really simplify and try and make it the default, right? That it is easier, it is clearer, it is at the moment that surgeon needs to clean and go in. If that surgeon arrived in the hospital in the morning and was told, here, remember to wash your hands, they will have encountered so many other things that are so distracting before they get into the OR that intervention is not as effective, right? At that point. And for us to really see what desired behaviors we want to see in society, we say three things must be present, right? One must be capable of doing the actual action and behavior that we want to see, right? So when we're all kids, you may not be as capable as, washing your hands. So you have to be taught. We've been taught, right? One must be motivated to do it, right? Again, the surgeon is very motivated not to infect people, but as kids, they will go and do whatnot and come with dirt in their hands and be like, I want to eat. They don't understand that, they'll get a tummy ache after that, right? And the last bit or the third bit is the opportunity to do it, right? Or the trigger that actually then results in the behavior that we want to see, right? So when you're designing for some of these things, you want to make sure and assess people's capability, people's motivation, but then people's opportunity to do that desired action as well.
So I love that framework of capability, motivation, and trigger. I think that's very helpful because when I think about a lot of design work that we do as change makers and as leaders, we spend a lot of time thinking in capability, actually. And because of that, you will have a lot of training, you will have a lot of teaching, but I don't know that we spend enough time thinking about, are these people motivated enough to act on this?
Yeah,
And secondly, are there triggers in the system that will make sure whether they are motivated or not, they do it?
correct.
And so I'm curious about some designs that you have seen that had good motivation, just so that I see some practical examples that could help us to see that, because I think capability people do it well. But
Yeah.
I feel the motivation and the trigger is not a space that we spend enough time on.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give you an example that I hope resonates with folks who are on the call. So, and I think we've all used M-Pesa, for example, right?
Mm.
Now, when you're doing your M-Pesa transaction, nowadays you will enter your PIN before you complete the transaction, right? Now, a couple of years ago, we were involved in a study that had you would enter your PIN at the end, right, without knowing how much that transaction would cost you, for example, right? And there are people who are motivated to say, you know what, I cannot afford that, but I do not have the right information. I do not have the capability to make the decision whether to complete that transaction or not, because you're getting me to enter my PIN post the fact, and I'll see my statement later, and that's when I'll know how much it costs me, right? But nowadays, folks are then like, I will send you 100 shillings in multiple transactions to hit whatever amount I would want without it exposing me or or making my financial outlook to be less than desirable, right? So that's one example. The other example that I can perhaps offer is there was a study we were involved in around sexual reproductive health a while back, right? And we're targeting young people, and we're trying to espouse the values of all these HIV prevention products that exist in the market. And I remember speaking to one young man who told me, you know what? I have access to condoms, right? The male condoms. So that's what I use. I don't care about all these other innovations and HIV products you guys are using, right? And even if I were to contract HIV, I have access to ARVs. I know what to do, right? What I fear the most, right? What I would not want to happen is for me to get a lady pregnant, right? Because then that means bringing life into this world. That means a lifelong burden of taking care of a family or a child, if you will, right? And the economic realities around that were just too heavy for them to comprehend. And that to me was a very interesting moment where who wouldn't want to sort of prevent themselves from contracting a disease such as HIV, right? But we've innovated and we've given people the capability to make informed choices and to engage whether they want to in risky sexual behavior or not. But there's something else that they're saying, oh my God, if this were to happen, my life would essentially be over because economically, I would not be able to sustain that as well, right? So that to me kind of provides this dual HIV family planning dynamic that at times exists in scenarios.
That makes so much sense. Because and I think there's some data that was released recently around HIV and universities and how the numbers are sort of going back up. But I think it's what you're saying is the capability work was done really well. So kudos to the world of development sector for doing that. But now perhaps what matters is a shift in motivation that needs to be more designed for. And then putting in place triggers that make sure people have it. And I like the M-Pesa example that you gave because it made me realize when I'm doing my transaction, regardless of how much I have a lot of things in my brain, in the end, at that last page, I will see the name of the person I'm sending, and that triggers me to reconfirm whether this is the right person. And so asking how do I design for both capability, which I guess is the education they do, And then motivation and trigger is important. And I want to highlight that because I know some of the people who are listening in and they're designing solutions, they're building products. I'm thinking of somebody here who is doing some work, Sheila, you're in my mind, and the work that she wants to do around building climate solutions that enable intergenerational conversations.
Mhm.
But I think practically what that means is not just do the capability training conversation, but to ask why should people be motivated enough to care about the climate and what are the triggers that you need to put in place that make that a reality, I think is a very important conversation that you're bringing on the table. And then maybe just last thing on this, and then we move away from it. The last time we remember we had a meeting with you, let me tell you what we all left with. The one thing was a
Yes.
conversation around loss aversion.
Yes.
And my team left with, we have been marketing all wrong. Apparently, loss aversion is a bigger motivation for human beings. And
Yes.
so I wondered around motivation, what is your experience around what works and what doesn't work as far as building motivation for people to do things?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe perhaps just to connect them is um, providing information to people. In this field, we call them ICE, information, communication, educational campaigns, is not enough, right?
Mhm.
And when you talk about motivation, at times, what just came to my mind right now is FOMO, the fear of missing
Mhm.
out. YOLO, you only live once, right?
True story.
Those things really drive people into certain forms of decision making, certain forms of action. And when you're depending on the field you're in, right? I was talking about sexual reproductive health in a moment, and at times the products in there are associated with folks who someone may say, you know what, this is for a younger person, an older person, this is someone who is riskier than me, it is not me. So there's an identity piece going around. I think at times we always try and think of, is there a way that I can benefit, right? And in this world, I think humans are very optimistic beings, right? But when you have that benefit, someone's like, you know what, this is not, this is luck, or it was my preparedness of opportunity. But when you're taking the same thing or a similar thing from someone, when it's already there, that pain is quite a lot, right? So someone would be willing to forego a benefit, right? Now or in the future, but for you to make them feel that they're worse off, right, than they currently are, is a very emotionally straining proposition, right? So I think it's a very powerful tool that very many people use in different spaces. These days, we're on an online meeting, you go to an online website and you want to purchase something and they tell you, there's a discount, but there's a timer. You have to do it now, right?
Yes.
And all the cookies and tech, if you come the next time, the price has gone up. And they're conditioning you to sort of say, the next time you're on our website, make sure you finish that transaction. Make sure you finish that journey that brought you here as well. So people use them in different ways. And I think that's something that we can predict about ourselves and our behaviors and actions.
I like it and I see it. I work with a coach and I was telling him last year we held a summit that was for me very frustrating because people signed up for it at the last minute. And what we did this year, and as we are not doing it for jokes, it's real. We set a date, end of this month, as an example, our summit cost will actually go up. And it's been interesting to watch the response of people towards it because then I have data that helps me to see how many people should I expect for the summit and therefore then how to plan for it.
Yeah.
And so I think the whole idea of I will get worse off really motivates us. And so, as leaders and as change makers and as people who are designing solutions, you must ask, in what way will I be worse off without your solution? If you cannot name for people how they become worse off without your solution, it's a nice to have. And
Yes.
nice to have doesn't work for many people. They need to be able to see, why am I worse off? because
Yes.
I don't have your solution. And those limitations of just the emotional strain of it will be a reason why people will be interested in your conversation.
Exactly. No, 100%.
I want to move to something else here that is around agency. So
Yes.
one of the bigger things that we do, the work that we do at its root is asking, what does it look like for us to enable leaders to become builders and build solutions that transform society ultimately in whichever form, big or large. And one of the things that we consider to be important in becoming a builder is activating agency
Mhm.
and sort of just enabling people to move from I know to I have agency.
Yes.
and and I didn't get into it in detail. I'd love to hear for you to hear from you on it. But there's some work I think you guys have done on the civic space and sort of how people can, and I don't even involved in it, but how people know what is wrong for them, but still do nothing about it.
Yeah.
When I was going through it, I remembered, well, one of the papers that I did a while back was the solution to many of the civics problems that people have today is lack of participation.
Mhm.
And my argument was if we all participated in civics issues, we would move things forward. It's the reason I support Gen Z greatly, because I
Yes.
think at the root of what they're doing is they're saying, this is our country
Yeah.
and it matters to us. It doesn't belong to y'all. Whether you're hustlers or dynasties, doesn't matter. It is ours. But I
Mhm.
think that study was speaking about how people can participate but do nothing beyond that.
Yeah.
Which for me still goes back to the conversation around agency. And so I'm wondering, what are some things that you've encountered around what enables people to move into action and have real agency in the spaces that, whether that's political, social, or otherwise?
Yeah, no, great question. And this is a question that I think we've been trying to tackle for the better part of almost a decade, right?
Wow.
Of how do you get people involved in the systems and the ecosystem that surrounds them and impact them and affect them, right? And especially as you started the question of from a leader to a builder, right? And you used this term Gen Z, right? And I would also want to introduce this term Gunzi as well, right?
Yep.
And it evokes different imagery in your head, right? Gen Z
For
is
sure.
a little bit more positive, a little bit more, yes, you guys agitated. And at least in Kenya in 2024, there was something that you did that really inspired and drove the rest of us, right?
Yes.
But in a similar way, you have pretty much similar people, right? And when you say Gunzi, it's very negative. It's very
Mm,
like what happened, a week and a half ago in Homer Bay.
mm,
And all of this is political participation, right? And I think
mm,
if you
mm.
remember 2024, what prompted it, right? What triggered the Gen Z protests, and at times it's not just in Kenya, right?
Mm.
There was a whole raft of, of the last
Sure.
couple of years. There's been a lot of youth agitation across the world, right?
Yes.
And they're saying, hey guys, we have come up in a system, we're well educated, but there are
Yeah.
no opportunities for us,
Mhm.
right? In Kenya, it was the finance bill, right? That was happening. And so I think when we're talking about agency and what spurs people to make action, we shouldn't necessarily think of it in silos, right?
Mm,
That for the 2024 Gen Z protest against the finance bill was purely political. It
mm.
was largely economical,
It
right?
actually was more economic. Yep, true.
Right? But we've, for one reason or another, as a society, right, as the Kenyan society, it's turned to
Mm,
be very political, I would imagine. There were
mm.
leaderless, there were fearless, there were tribeless.
Very blessed. Yeah, all those
But, but,
nice
but
places.
right, but some of the leaders that emerged have sort of quote unquote been captured by different political parties at this point. And I
True.
don't think you hear an articulation around some of the economic concerns that folks had, right?
That's true,
And if
absolutely.
anything, you actually see an expression of the kind of economic agitation by Gunzis who are mobilized in very different ways, just paid out and they move forward. And I'm not saying that
Both
Gen Z.
are actually still economic issues, actually,
Yes.
because at the root of both challenges is we're not building enough economic opportunities for a generation, and so they will convert them into what they convert them into. That's an interesting view. I like it.
Exactly. No, 100%. And I'll end with this on this. There's the Nairobi business community, right? That emerged around that time.
Yes.
And the idea, right, was we are protecting our economic interests, but we will express it politically and we'll arm ourselves, and the security apparatus does not have will not do us anything, as people say, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's how I would choose to look at agency of what is it that I am acting in, whose interest is it in my interest? How do I protect what I have built or what I am developing? And I think when you look at it that way, this was a political economic thing, but when you look at it as I have the agency to act in a way that is to my benefit, then that's a recipe for sort of folks actually acting more for their own interests as well.
Yes. That's interesting, because it takes me to a conversation I had seen online, and I just thought I'd bring it here as well, because my understanding was, and maybe there's more a question around, how do leaders distinguish between a bad choice and a rational response to environment? Because I think one of the work, and I will repeat that question in a short while, but one of the things I loved that I encountered in your work is sort of the power of context. A good friend of mine is doing quite a bit of work around building contextual intelligence into development work. Yes. And I think that's a space, it's getting better, but for the longest time, context was not considered. And so people would show up from the West into Africa and put up solutions that just don't matter here. And I like the way how you guys talk about context. I saw something around people, place, and mind space, and that when you're building any solution, you must think about context in the sense of the people, the place, and mind space. And so I thought maybe elaborate a bit more on those two, what people, place, and mind space mean in the context of context. And but also, how do you distinguish bad choice and context?
Yeah, for sure. It's a very interesting question. Maybe even to tie it to agency, because I'm seeing the arc here, Esther. Great questions. One of the earlier engagements we had as Busara was to evaluate this program that was rolling out unconditional cash transfers, right? So in development, you can imagine all sorts of interventions where if it's in education, you're giving sponsorship or books or employing more teachers. If it's in health, you're supplying drugs or building hospitals, etc. And there's this thing of, well, within development, people know what their needs are, right? Don't go and give someone a mosquito net and they end up using it as a fishing net, right? Because they have to eat first. And so the concept of unconditional cash transfers was quite seductive. And we came in and we were helping to evaluate this. And there's a very big global organization now that has grown as a result of that work, GiveDirectly, right? They're doing a phenomenal job. But when GiveDirectly was starting, and this was in Kenya, they were working in CI accounting.
Directly started in Kenya. Sorry, I had to just jump in there.
Yes, it did. Founded outside, but really some of the foundational work was here, and in CI accounting specifically. And the year, when they were starting, there's a very prominent CI person who was the leader of the free world, right? Now, you can imagine...
President Obama is his name.
President Obama is his name. Now you can imagine where you're going to help folks who are living in poverty, right? You have your own inclusion criteria. And at that point, I think it was that the house they lived in had to be 100% organic, right? Mud thatched, grass thatched, that sort of thing. And they're giving this unconditional cash transfer. And it was to the tune of 1,000 USD, right? That's
Ooh,
big
that's
money.
good money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even back then. And for one reason or another, it then got around that, you know what, we are embarrassing our son, President Obama, because we still lived in mud-thatched houses. So now he has decided to give us money and we should upgrade our houses. So all of a sudden, people who had the discretion, the agency to decide what to do with that money ended up fixing the roofs. So it was all
What?
bring iron thatched roofs, right?
Wow.
Iron roofs, not iron thatched roofs. Iron roofs for a reason. And there's a song actually on this, right? There's a musician who all of a sudden you walk around here and you're just seeing all these iron sheets going up. But this was meant to be unconditional. This was meant to be them
Yeah,
deciding
decide
what,
what's important to them, not
right?
what is important to anybody else.
And you never know why that started, right? But anyway, I think that kind of gives you an example, right?
Mm,
To
mm,
sort of the question you just asked me.
mm.
Yeah.
Ooh, you just took it to a place that is interesting because I think part of what you're sharing then is the power of narratives in spaces.
Yes. Mhm.
I was reading I think the case study that you guys have for the perception of care work and domestic work and how people perceive it,
Yes.
and how in Kenya's context, as an example, it's perceived as women's work, but
Mhm.
also it's a cultural societal perception, but also the language behind it. And I think the language was the one which intrigued me the most.
Yeah.
It's even women, when we think about care work, we talk about it in the context of mboch
Mhm.
and underpaid mboch, which then
Yes.
almost further reduces the importance of domestic work.
Mhm.
So all that goes back to sort of your language and the narratives and how
Yes.
then those ultimately then take away or enable agency.
100%. And it's such a powerful thing that in Kenya, there's legislation that dictates the minimum amount you should pay someone who's engaged in domestic work, for example, right? But, and I don't want to poll our attendees today, but I would imagine not very many people hit that, right?
Yeah,
And the things you hear is, but I'm providing you with accommodation if they're
yeah,
a living. Oh, but
yeah,
I'm providing you with food if
yeah.
they're what, right? And there's a whole spectrum, I'm sure, with different folks not necessarily giving it as part of the compensation, but helping with perhaps school fees or some community obligations that may come up. And I think that's a very important thing, that narratives at times can fly in the face of kind of even legality, right? There's
Mhm.
legislation that's been approved, but for one reason or another, us as society have decided, right, or are not willing to change.
Mhm.
And domestic work is interesting because I think our societies are changing. If you imagine a couple of decades ago when we all lived communally in villages and with folks who were helping here and there, but now in living in cities, etc. There's need for it, but how do you do it? And was still at times even child domestic workers, right?
Yeah.
And you then almost subjugate someone for life, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
well, but you don't have a family. Why should I pay you more? But you don't, right? There are all these stories and narratives and quote unquote excuses we have in our heads when it comes to some of these issues.
Ooh. And I guess and maybe that's what makes human beings very complex because the idea that you can build solutions, we're not machines, I guess, is the point. And so if I'm gonna think about domestic work, because you do need to, we as a society, we need to think about domestic workers. We need to reframe that, but it's not a law process. If you are from what you're describing, it's very easy to have very many laws, and we
Mhm.
will just walk away from the laws because the context has narratives that make us see domestic work a certain way, which therefore then means if you're committed to shifting that, you need to first go to the root of that narrative and then use it to be able to move that society forward.
100%. And there's a question of identity, right? And even to move it beyond domestic
I was
work.
going to go to identity, actually. I love it.
I can see the arc, right? And there's a question of identity as regards to how we see ourselves, right? How others see us, how we see others as well, right? And recently we were having this conversation of, you were talking about citizens and agency and kind of citizens and government, right? And it was a question of, well, who forms government? Government is just us, right? It's the same way. But at times we look at government in a way that they are very different and separate beings, right? Or if someone was, especially in kind of civil society spaces, agitating for a particular reform, and in one way or the other, if they were had the opportunity to join the government, people then say, oh, they've switched, right? They've changed. Or right? Or if you think of the police, especially, right? I don't necessarily talk about military. And when they go through training, right? Some of it is told, no, you are now government. You are now police. Everyone else is a citizen. You are different from them, right? And there are ways in which we build institutions or some of our systems to have those identities in a way that then results in, just what we end up seeing, how at times the police force and the citizenry keep on clashing as well, right? But also when you think of identity in that way, even for ourselves, I think we tend to, right, and there've been multiple studies on this, we tend to evaluate or consider ourselves with our intentions, right? But we tend to judge or evaluate others with their outcomes, right?
Okay, so we consider ourselves with our intention, but with others' outcomes.
With outcomes, exactly, right? So there's when there've been studies of, it's at night, it's almost end month, over the weekend, people will visit several watering holes, for example, and then they'll get behind the wheel and head home, right? And hopefully they're safe or they'll arrive safely. But if an accident were ever to occur, or if the police decide to mount roadblocks, it just happened once, right? But people still do that. They know it's wrong, but we kind of still do that. But the moment you label someone, you're a drunk driver almost, right? They've been studies, someone's like, no. My intention was, I just went for one, and then Esther happened to be around and something happened, right? Or some of the other ways this has been studied is you're on the road and someone hits you from behind, right? You're driving and someone hits you. And you get out and you're angry and you're like, Esther, why did you hit me, right?
Yeah.
But nowadays with technology, they're driverless cars as well, right? And so you get out and you're like, oh, there's no Esther. There's no one operating this. It was an accident. They happen, right? All of a sudden, you don't have someone to blame, and there isn't an identity that you're, putting yourself against. But some interesting studies there as well.
Oh, that's powerful, because I think what then that means, when I think about myself as a builder and the many people and the few other people in the room who are thinking about themselves as builders, there's a lot there you need to think about. I think the first thing I'm hearing you say is you have to almost get into the mind space of anybody you're designing with or for.
Yes.
Actually, I think design with is maybe the answer, not for. Because if you design for, you will land with money that you're giving them for free. But if you haven't figured out the context of that, this is Siaya, which is our son's home.
Yes.
And I guess it's a very hard thing then, because you would have to be very embedded in society to sort of figure out that mind space, and therefore then design in a way that is able to be taken into account. Is that what you find? Does that mean that behavior change is a very difficult thing?
Yes, no, 100%. And humans are complex, right? And it's meant to be that difficult. And I think in our field, we're also self-critical that we've always thought that behavior change has to be me informing Esther, you need to change.
Yeah.
Your actions are from a point of ignorance, so I need to educate you.
Yeah.
You are acting against your best interest, so I need to influence you. Right, in that way. In the case of CIF, for example, it was a successful cash transfer program, even though people ended up doing what they thought the money was for. The next county that this program moved to was Homa Bay, right? And it was interesting to observe that while in CI people were open to receiving the funds, in Homa Bay people are like, nope, what's going on? Same community, but one thing the organization hadn't taken into account early on was there's a very different belief system as well, and there's a very different kind of religious inclination in Homa Bay than in Siaya, right? And so that is a very strong institution that folks are like, no way anyone gives you free money for you to go. Are you devil worshippers? Are you going to sacrifice my kids? Are you what again? The power of narratives, right? And they had time just dispersing this free money that they had, and so they had to kind of go and unpack and figure out what actually is happening, what actually is going on there.
Wow. And I think I do hope you're all hearing that you really must spend time for behavior change to happen. You must spend a lot of time understanding the context, getting the mind space of the people you're designing with, and ensuring that you understand not the surface level. And I like the way you guys define context to include both data and experiences, lived experiences. I've been in rooms where people release data about this continent that just make me think, no, care what that data says. I just fully disagree with it. But there's, especially in the Western spaces, there's they elevate data a lot.
Yes.
And I guess it's the society that they are. I don't think our society data even tells half of the story.
Yeah.
We are too complex for that. Maybe they're more homogeneous, maybe. But I just know my people, they are very different. And so when I look at data and I don't have lived experience, it always for me tells half the story. And so understanding context in the context of both data, lived experiences, going there and embedding within the societies perhaps then becomes part of the work that builders must do.
No, absolutely. And I think that's an interesting point. And my question to you will be, what is data, right? And kind of what does that mean? And why isn't lived experience a part of what forms data, right? Both quantitatively, but qualitatively. But something that's interesting is that at times when we're talking about lived experiences or when we're making decisions based on that as well, you are then, and as a leader, as a builder, right? You are then using quote unquote a sample size of one yourself, right?
True.
Which is very interesting, right? And so you need to sort of try and figure out and unpack that and say, okay, when is that useful, right? For the decisions, the actions that are needed, and when is data as broadly as you can define it, including some of those lived experiences, including at times we call it indigenous knowledge, right?
Love it.
Because we used to be able to figure out how to tackle climate change in our space, right? We used to be able to figure out how to eat nutritious food in our space, right? But for some reason, as we've transformed as a society, and as you were saying, at times adopted, practices and beliefs that were not indigenous to us, there's been some sort of friction there. At Busara, at times we have this mantra, be more than weird, right? And weird then becomes this Western educated.
Just say that again. Love it. Just say
be more than weird.
Be more than weird. Love it.
Be more than weird. Right? No, please do. And weird in this context stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, right?
Nice.
Right. And there's, at times I think of different traditions or how different things manifest in our society. And in recent years, there have been news reports, and I believe them. It's been true that some societies or communities around central Kenya have been complaining that particularly men, right, are just getting into alcoholism, right?
Yeah.
And I think there were ladies complaining that, well, conjugal rights aren't being met. What's going on? Right? Or you find that a young man becomes quote unquote a man and starts beating the mother and saying, I am a man now. You're a woman, right?
Yeah.
But or if you will, female genital mutilation, for example, right? Or if you and the what it meant to be a man back in the day, and you going through an initiation process, you being able to move out and sort of start your own family and household, or the physical brutal act, really, right, of FGM was coupled, right, with some teaching, some adoption of this. These are the community values. This is what we would like to see. This is how you ensure continuity. Now, some of those values, some of those teachings have been lost, while the physical manifestation of them remain, right? So do you still try and make sure that as you're transitioning young folks into adulthood, that those teachings are, even though the barbaric and kind of backward physical manifestation of them are dealt with? And those are some of the things that I think we can really reckon with to try and transform our societies.
Oh, love it. I have a question there, but before I ask the question, I think what I'm hearing you say is in every work, we must first understand the narratives behind it, because when you understand the values and the teaching, it's almost the narrative that is behind it.
Yes.
And that's only way that you can be able to do real change, because then you start at the root of the narrative. And I remember being in a space, I've done quite a bit of work with African Americans. I like them, and we have some conversations here and there. But I think one of the things recently I have seen them doing is almost shifting how they are called from Black American. And I think they have the most strange political conversations, but I will bring it here still. From Black American, and they're calling themselves chocolate. And I think what they're trying to do is shift blackness to what is black, really. And so then they move to we are more chocolate than we are black.
Yes.
And at the root of that is they want to shift the narrative, because there's a narrative that's driven with black that doesn't serve the black people. And ultimately, when they look at themselves, they probably are more chocolate than they are black, and so they're moving towards that. And I think the reason I give that as an example is if you go to the mind space and really understand the root of anything, then you can start to shift from values to teachings to whatever it is that you need to do. But I think we tend to like to start at the top, then we want to do the surface work.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think narratives are powerful. People love stories, right? They lean into them, they get drawn in, and they're like, oh, I can connect. I don't necessarily need to have experienced the same, but it sparks something in my mind, right? So I think narratives are very powerful tools. The ways to use them in good way or bad way, right? The ways to really empower someone, right? When you kind of positively reinforce folks, but there are also ways that it can sort of lull you. And I don't know why this is what comes, but if you remember 2022 at Bomas of Kenya, and we had choirs singing, and everything was very peaceful, right? And you're smiling and you're giggling, and right, there was a narrative that was being perpetuated at some point, and then at some point hell broke loose, and whatever happened. But these are important tips and or tools that people deploy in different ways.
Yeah, and I think what that example is very good, because my experience with narratives is I find politicians know how to use them, and they use them for badness, if there's such a word. I think a lot of people who want to drive society forward and build change positively, they don't go back and use those tools. I mean, when you think about MAGA is a narrative. And he did a fantastic job of building a narrative. The Hope conversation of Yes We Can was a narrative.
Yes.
And so the builders must learn to go back and sit with those narratives and use them for good. But I agree with you in terms of can be used for good or for bad. I want to hear from people, what are we hearing and what are some questions that
Yes.
are coming through for us. And as we do that, and hopefully Fidel, you will pick up some questions for me. I am intrigued by the weird, and I wonder whether it is a big challenge to move it in because your work is international, and so you
Yeah.
sit in a lot of international rooms. What's the reception of that weird idea?
It's the concept itself is interesting. So for us, behavioral science, it started out in the weird spaces, right? It was in universities where undergraduate students would show up at labs and really play all these different behavioral games, and professors would write papers and so on and so forth. Busara is the first behavioral science organization in what folks call the Global South, right? So we were kind of being more than weird and moving it beyond that. But what we also realized is that we were then just providing access to a bigger population, and folks would still write those papers, right? Someone would come and do research in Kenya, and then when they publish the paper, the Kenyans who they did research on cannot access it. It's behind a paywall. It's behind a journal. It's in a way that is not accessible. And that becomes very challenging. I think what we've done is to try and then move beyond kind of this global South, global North dichotomy and into what I now call global majority, global minority contexts, right? So the idea then, you were mentioning the idea of Blackness and Black Americans and chocolates, right? The health challenges that we face here or that I face here, right, could be the same health challenges that a Black American, say, faces in a way, or even if it's a white American, given income levels, right? Given societal sort of identities, etc. So I think it's very important for us to then realize that we can learn from each other, right? In those spaces. There were, I was in New York a while back and saw a HIV prevention campaign there. I was like, oh my God, this is almost like an end product of what we've been trying to do, right? And so the learning shouldn't stop that it is, or because it's from a global North, global South perspective, learning should and knowledge should translate throughout, right? Methods should translate throughout, but there is a way that we can define and form communities that do not stick to some of these what I would imagine are colonial conceptions of boundaries and whatnot. At the end of the day, we're all humans, and some of the human experiences that we face, say in Kenya, in Nairobi, are very similar to the human experiences that other people face all over the world, regardless of kind of the society they live in.
And that's very real. The part of the reason, for example, I got engaged in the Black community is I discovered the Black person in Brazil and the Black person in Haiti and the Black person in Africa have the same experience. And in India, they really have the same experiences. And even with that person in New York who has lower income, I mean, I sit down with them and they could be my sister that we're talking with.
Yes.
And I think the problem of the way the world was designed before design is the one they keep going back to is we end up restarting the same things. I mean, the studies you've done for HIV here, New York shouldn't have to start from ground zero. It's too much waste of time and lives if you cannot, and especially in a digital world, there must be better ways for us to learn from the human experience.
No, 100%. Yeah.
I want to lift some questions here, and then depending with whether we get through one or two, I have a few more questions, but I'm not sure we'll get through to it. And I'm just going to pick them the way they are. Renee Mushiri says, to what extent do modeling And one, modeling; two, ensuring a clear understanding of the why influence behavior change. I think that's a good question to sit with. Does modeling work for behavior change? To what extent does it work?
Yeah.
And then also a clear why. And so that's again a clear sense of purpose upfront. Does it work in terms of behavior change?
Yeah, for sure. So with modeling, it'd be the kind of lingo we would use is segmentation as well, right? So kind of behavioral segmentation. And I think it's a very powerful concept that at times when, folks are doing research or when you're engaging in all sorts of administrative issues, you'll be asked, your name, yes, but also your gender, your age, your sex, your occupation.
Mm.
And these are kind of demographic data to try and then say, okay, in this society, women tend to do this more than men, right? The domestic work example you'd offered. In this society, young people tend to be more agitated, and Gen Zs will engage politically more than, millennials or something like that. But when you think of building a behavioral profile as well, right? You then start to understand or appreciate perhaps some of the nuances or biases that may exist of my risk appetite, right? When I was talking about the HIV example, for example, would cut across whether it is my sexual and reproductive health, whether it is my financial behavior, right? Whether it is my nutrition behavior, because I am still the same person at the end of the day, right? And so you start thinking of some of those things of risk and trust and, peer influence, etc. And you're then able to identify folks who perhaps will, as people call it, will take up a new product or program faster, are perhaps a bit more hesitant and let me see what everyone else is doing, and then I'll kind of make the decision. I will reject it fully, right? And especially with sort of AI taking over our space. And I'm surprised AI hasn't even come up in our conversation, because these days it makes its way everywhere, right? But the folks who are like, it has solved all our problems. There are folks who are very skeptical, right? And all between. So I think being able to then understand within society what behavioral segments exist, and then trying to understand that these are not static, and given the engagement, they'll keep on moving. And there's an ecosystem in play that as I engage, as I push back, there'll be other folks, changing their behavior or altering, which may in turn influence me. So I think that's a very important piece, perhaps on the modeling. That's what I would say. And then on the why, it's some of these behavioral factors that I'm talking about risk, about trust, that once I understand, someone's health risk, for example, more or less it may be consistent as well with their financial risk. So you can almost do cross-cutting. Or once I understand someone's hesitancy or approach to a particular disease, I was talking about HIV, then I can probably understand their hesitancy or approach to, malaria, right? And so those things I think are important for us to ensure we surface. Yeah.
I like it, because what I'm hearing is the power of behavioral segments instead of determining the choices that people will make.
Yeah.
And I guess it takes me to a question that I've been wondering: to what extent, because I think this is useful and I can see how Safaricom will come to Francis and say, we need to roll out this program. What do we need to do for motivation and triggers? Do some research, build for our segments. Let's use those to be able to build motivation and triggers. Because I imagine it's also a costly process.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering to what extent you're able to do this kind of work outside your large institutions. And what you're thinking is in terms of how do we ensure people who are in small, emerging institutions think about behavioral segments, behavioral, what are you doing in that context, and what is your observation around it?
Yeah, thanks. It's if I get you correct, it's almost like a capacity building question, right? And
Yes.
I wouldn't. Again, we're all humans, and I think we're all the same. And I think whether we know it or not, we call it behavioral science and think it's a very fancy term. But I believe that a lot of people engage in trying to understand people's behavior, right? From when we're young to when we're very old, going back to that hand washing example and what's going on, right? So I think in different institutions, it's sort of what have we been taught on what makes an effective institution? What have we learned? Why is it that whether big or small, demographics are always front and center of whatever data we are collecting, right? And how do we start ensuring people get this appreciation for perhaps some of the more behavioral aspects of it? And I don't necessarily think it requires a big investment per se. The biggest thing is, how does an institution, regardless of what program they're doing, continuously learn, unlearn, relearn, and sort of understand the space they're in? And I think that, to me, then becomes a very simple, if I may, way to make sure they're incorporating some of these behavioral insights.
Love it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pick up a few more, and I will pick up a few together so that they form part of our closing statements. There's somebody here who's written, said, from a behavioral science perspective, what does it take to move young people from knowing about climate change and environmental issues to actually seeing environmental stewardship as part of who they are, and how can intergenerational learning help make those behaviors lasting within families, schools, and communities? Maybe that as a case study could be one thing that we could speak into and just sort of share some thoughts. But let me just see if there's anything else. Groups of people are complex adaptive systems, and we cannot predict a linear progression from one state or set of behaviors to another. This is where we need to keep in mind the work of some guy, Dave, at Sinefin in mind. And I like that conversation, so that we can save our youth. I'm not sure where it was going for alcohol. We have to get a solution in our country. Some of industries are closed. No cheap alcohol can be found. That's an interesting example. I think that's somebody from Rwanda. I probably will just focus on the case study. I am a consultant leading at a Busara consultant leading, have one of your people leading a peace building and development intelligence program. The question is, given the scarcity of funding resources in humanitarian sector and localization, which influences delivery of more or less, how does behavioral science move beyond systems analysis, but also strategizing better efficiencies that also de-risk local delivery actors? I don't know. I think you may understand it a bit more. But I think for me, and you may have spoken into it a bit, what I catch from it is resources and behavioral science gap. And how do people address that, given the scarcity of funding resources in humanitarian and development sector, and localization? How does behavioral science move beyond systems analysis, but also strategizing better efficiencies that also de-risk local delivery actors who have to face communities who may be unsatisfied with reduced service delivery? I will just ask you to share what stands for you. And then on the question of capacity building, and building on your answer, Francis, how does social sector organization build that capacity internally to synthesize and use it? And does Busara offer trainings? People are interested in you training them.
Okay, good. Thanks, Esther. That was a lot, so hopefully I can
just one or two
and try.
Whatever stands out for you, and we can give more detailed responses later on. I just wanted to see what.
Yeah, my recency bias. So offer trainings, yes, we do. Very happy to support and kind of try and tailor them. I think the biggest thing that we ourselves are trying to move from, and I think that behavioral science is increasingly being more self-critical of, is that when we started, and behavioral science came into, I think, pop culture kind of into the mainstream by this book by a Nobel laureate, Richard Thaler, Nudge, right? And so the premise was just all these kind of little tips and tricks can have outsized impact. And so it was really focused on those types of interventions, and really focused on some of what we were talking about earlier, that you, Esther, need to change if only I provide these informational kind of communication, education campaigns. I think it's moving past that to now saying, be self-critical of ourselves as well as institutions, right? Formal, but also informal and social norms, and try and see how the focus on institutions can help us to ensure that a learning in one intervention area would lead to a solution or progress being made in a potentially different intervention area without starting from scratch, right? And I think one of the criticisms development has suffered in the past, right? I think especially communities, the question on if communities may be unsatisfied with reduced service delivery. And what comes to mind is give a man a fish and they eat for a day, or teach a man how to fish and, right, they eat for a lifetime. So with all the development work that's been happening, how does behavioral science help us change that development ecosystem itself, that when I go and do a health intervention, right, I am actually doing an educational intervention, an cultural intervention, and the learnings from it will be cross-cutting, right? Because if I go into a community and I'm like, oh, I brought health interventions and now you have to rely on me and give me all your problems and I'll solve your education and agriculture, I would say, and this is a very crass statement perhaps to make, I would say no, please, right?
Yeah,
because then you're kind of keeping me in this state of dependency. And I think that's some of the criticism that the development has faced in the past, that whatever you do, how do you perhaps even connect to that capacity building of folks have now the knowledge to be able to articulate, to diagnose their own issues, to collect data in their own way, to then say, this seems to be the biggest challenge, to design what that looks like. And previously, our communities were doing that, right? And I think the biggest thing, the biggest sort of, or the most recent and big evidence of this is during COVID, that when COVID came, there was, folks were saying that we'll be dropping like flies in the streets, right?
I rolled my eyes.
But there was some learning that we'd done. We'd never encountered COVID before, but there was some learning that had happened in other sort of health areas, educational areas, that allowed that not to be the case, right? So that's what I would share.
I love it. And I think what I'm hearing you say is the bigger work is around how we design solutions and design them intentionally, and sort of thinking through the capabilities, the motivations, the triggers that need to be put in those designs. When I look at sort of some of what I have left out, we've covered quite a bit, but I like one of the things that I'm hearing is we label people resistant, apathetic, or unmotivated, when actually it's that we've not designed for any different. I like to go back to the civics, because I think civics connect us all, and I am committed to making us civically engaged citizens. But I think those can translate into economic, social kind of issues. That what we term as people don't care about climate, people don't care about politics, is perhaps in some ways design gaps. That we need to ask what needs to be redesigned to enable people to engage a bit more. The other thing I'm hearing you talking about, and maybe this is a good place for us to sort of just start to bring this conversation home, is trust. To what extent is trust part of behavioral infrastructure, and how should institutions be thinking about trust building? And actually, that's the last question we will cover because of time.
And it's sort of what is trust, right? And time we can break it down into that, but also these famous sayings of it takes a really long time to build trust, and then it takes a microsecond to break it, right? I think when you think of trust, it is it in whatever institution or system you're working in, is it verifiable, for example, right? Is it transparent in whatever we're engaging in? To me, it's, I was recently talking with someone about money and banking, right? And how there is dabawalas around the world, right? Kind of the Somali folks sending money here and there. And someone could not understand for the life of them how I go to Nairobi and I give someone, here is what, 100,000 shillings, and I send a code and someone receives it in Kampala, just like that, right? Without knowing each other, right? And that system is very robust and it's very trustworthy, right? And there's something there that underpins it, as opposed to, oh, you have to go to the bank and incur maybe some of these at times crazy high charges. So I think trust is a very important piece. The way I would consider it is what constitutes trust, and what are the three elements? Is it something that, as I mentioned, someone can verify, can rely on, has repeated? It's not a one-off, right? Has repeatedly delivered on their promise as well, right? But yeah, I think it's very important.
Yeah, that's a huge one again, Francis. This is why I knew this would be a fantastic conversation, and we must get you back at some point because I think there's a conversation to be had around design practically. But I think what I'm hearing, even with trust is designed for because it's that you design something that people can verify, and so trust is built. It can be repeated, and so trust is built. Maybe it's that there is a history we have of Swift as an example, that makes us think if you put in money in from my account to the next account, there's something that is reliable enough that ensures the money goes.
Yes.
But the day you have that money, for example, going from my account to Francis, well, I intended for it to go to Fidel, you then have a trust gap that comes in. And so there's some intentionality around designing for trust that I think as builders we must think about. What are the things that we specifically put in place whose job is to enable people to see this is verifiable, this is repeatable, what stories, what identities are in place that sort of serve as a friction to that trust gap. I am sure I haven't covered everything we needed to cover. It is not even possible to do so. But I think I just want to close there. And perhaps I don't know if you have any last remarks, some thoughts that you just want to share as we close this around something that can help a builder.
Yeah, I think for us the biggest lesson, right, and one that I'm championing is for behavioral science and for humans and moving beyond the individual to interventions, is this idea of institution building, right? And I think that's where real transformation happens, when our institutions, both formal, informal, our social norms, repeatedly does something and strengthens sort of its ability to continue adapting as well, right? Because that's super important, and our societies are not static, they're very dynamic, and that's what will continue to build trust.
Love it. And I like what you just ended with in terms of institution building. I always challenge a lot of us. We do initiatives. We don't think about institutions. I was talking to somebody today and we're talking about, I'm not going to name the name and I have to just manage my brain not to, but there's a funder in this market who's given a lot of money in the space of youth work. But when you go back and look at the actual impact, they weren't interested in the impact. They were interested in sort of just pushing the money out. And some of the money should have actually gone towards institution building so that then you have institutions that can carry the trust, that can carry the culture, that can carry the narratives, the identities that are needed to make sure that the impact is significant. And so that is a good place to think about. I think it raises a whole question by itself, but I think it's a good place for us to pause. I want to say a very big thank you for making the time to join us. Truly appreciate it and appreciate the work that you guys are doing. You have big fans, even if we don't announce it. We truly love the work that you guys are doing. I cannot wait for us. Carol, I'm sure will reach out, but we cannot wait to figure out something we can do practically. I think it's time for us to figure out what we can build with you guys. But thank you so much for this conversation. We will close there. A big thank you to everybody who has stayed with us till the end. From the chat room, I can see this was a phenomenal conversation for all of us. So asanteni sana. We like to take a photo before we finish. And so I'm going to ask Fidel to do the photos. I am trying to remove the spotlight for Francis that we join the main.
Okay.
Yes. But Asanteni Sana, please switch on your cameras. Let's take a photo of us. A very big thank you again to each one of you for joining us. I know you found this conversation to be helpful. You can do one thing for us. Please put up on LinkedIn a post around your takeaways, tag Lapid, tag Busara. We would love to hear from you guys what you picked up from this conversation. We will continue with this. I think we have just gotten at the surface level of this conversation, but it was a good starting point, and we hope to continue to build the conversation. So thank you for joining us. Please put up a comment and post and celebrate the work that Busara and even Lapid is doing. We would really appreciate it. And then we smile, and then I end us with a word of prayer. Fidel.
Thank you, Esther. Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Francis. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Arnold. Thank you, Esther G. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Petronila, Denise, Benna. It's nice to see some of you are back. Isaac Washira. I have to just lift yours. Isaac is an accountant that you all should know, but I love that I can see you. Eric, it's nice to see you here. Jennifer Gumba, thank you for joining. Roslyn, thank you for joining. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation. We truly appreciate it. Please pick just one thing that you can go and do differently. If we had time, we would pick up some takeaways, but we don't, and we don't want to keep us for too long. Next dialogue is, I believe, on 10th or 17th. One of those two, and we will start with sort of some takeaways and how we are executing them. I close there with a word of prayer. Father, we honor you, we bless you for the opportunity for us to be able to build solutions that serve our people. Thank you for the knowledge that we've picked up in this place, Lord. I pray that we would be good soil and that those seeds would find good soil that it reproduces in. We honor you, we bless you for the work that Busara is doing. I pray that you continue to increase it, and the work that Lapid is doing, you continue to increase it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much, everybody. I wish you all a very blessed evening. Thank you, Francis. We celebrate you and the work that you're doing. Asanteni Sana. Thank you, Carol, for putting this together. Carol has done all the curating. Please follow her LinkedIn. She tends to debrief these conversations. And Asanteni Sana for being part of this conversation. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good night. Bye, everyone.